I'm very happy to introduce our two speakers and two candidates today. I've known them both for well over 20 years. In fact, when I first got involved in fighting incineration, when we lived up in Canton, New York, one of the first people we met was Mark Dunlea, who had written a paper on incineration, and he and his wife, Judith Enck, we've known since those days. That was 1985. That's a long time ago. And Mark, we've known Mark also because of his work on fighting poverty, working for people, you know, poor people, etc. And of course, his wife, Judith, became the regional director of the EPA for regions 2. And I met her again in Puerto Rico. But that's Mark Dunlea. We're going to hear from him in a moment. And then Howie. Howie, I think I first met Howie in Syracuse. Yeah. I think the first time I actually met you was standing outside the Syracuse incinerator, the Onondaga County incinerator. I remember saying, you know, we have the cathedral of consumption at one end of town and the high-tech toilet at the other, namely this incinerator. So Howie, Hawkins, we've been working with for many, many years on a lot of good causes. So now we've got to get them voted into office. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Now let's hear from the candidates themselves.
Well, thank you, Paul and Ellen, for hosting us and for the Binghamton Greens. And in fact, I always remember, we find Paul humorous. I know everybody else already knows that Paul is quite funny. But Paul had hosted a retirement roast or something for my wife like 25 years ago, and did a tremendous job. And Ellen, of course, was always the brains of the operation. Right. With, was it work on waste or work against?
Waste not.
Waste
work
not.
on waste yesterday, yeah.
Right. But as Paul said, I'm Mark Dunlea, and so I'm going to give a brief little background on myself, and then talk about why I'm running, and then we're going to have Howie Hawk. And I could talk for a couple hours, so maybe after about 15 minutes, somebody should, you know, cut me. So I was thinking about this on the way over, and unlike Howie, I was very apolitical as a high school person. In fact, did not get political until I went to college. And one of the people who my mother particularly admired quite a bit when I was growing up was Ralph Nader. And so I went to school at RPI, and a couple of weeks into the semester, somebody showed up from Ralph Nader's organization. And they said they were starting this new group, who were going to try to start this group, eventually became New York Public Interest Research Group, or NYPIRG. And I just assumed everybody was going to show up at the meeting, and you know, I get down there at the student union, and there's like 5 of us. And so I, you know, spent 5 years, basically I was one of the co-founders of NYPIRG, and I was one of the first chairpersons of National PIRG. I was the first chairperson of National PIRG. And, you know, but it sort of convinced me that, you know, lobbying wasn't really the way to change things, and one had to do organizing. And when I graduated from law school, I literally hitchhiked to Texas and hooked up with this group called ACORN, Association of Community Organizations Reform Now, which is now New York Communities for Change. And I spent 3 years organizing with them in the South and the Southwest. Eventually became a state head organizer of both Iowa ACORN and Arizona ACORN. But one thing ACORN taught, you know, it organizes low and moderate income people. And, you know, I joined them because they had the reputation of being the best community organizers in the United States. You know, use the Saul Alinsky type of approach. And one of the things they always did was, you know, they're always about how do you get power for low and moderate income people. And they always incorporated electoral politics into their work. Within 6 months of starting a new group, you were going to be involved in some type of election. So a lot of people don't know this, but in the late 70s, ACORN tried to start a national political party. And so I was involved with that. And basically they were unable to get the black churches and the unions, who were their organizational, institutional base, to leave the Democratic Party. So they went back into the Democratic Party in the 1980, but a number of us said, they had convinced us of the need for independent third-party politics, and so quite a few of us left and became the initial staff of the Citizens Party and Barry Commoner. And in fact, that's where not exactly how I met my wife, but I was her campaign manager for city council in 1980 while she was still a college student. Interestingly, Acorn has continued to try to do electoral politics. They eventually set up the new party, and then when the United States Supreme Court ruled against fusion, that states could prohibit that, they moved their operation to New York State and started the Working Families Party. And in fact, Danny Cantor, who was the head of the Working Families Party, we trained together in 1977 in Texas. But that's sort of what brought me into electoral politics, with a very big emphasis on environmental issues. And eventually I became the first chair, or the co-founder of the Green Party here in New York State. A little bit of my background, I have been an elected official. I was elected to my town board, a little town called Postonkill, where I still live, which is a little bit outside of Albany. It's about 4,000 people. Very rural area, 3-to-1 Republican to Democrat. And I got elected. For garbage was one of the big issues, trash. And then also I became a world-class expert, unfortunately, on gravel. It happens to be Postonkill that we're at the end of the Hudson Valley. We are where the glacier stopped. And so Postonkill is the gravel capital of Northeast United States. And we had its own individual problems. But I got elected, and one of the things, we just had a 25% tax hike before I got elected. So I actually ended up cutting taxes every single year I was in elective office. I'm probably the only elected official who can say that. And I just said, I'm going to cut waste, and I'm going to cut corruption. And so one of the things I did was, crazy idea, I said every single contract we have in this town, we're going to put out for bid. Man, that's one way you get cheaper prices, you put out for bid. So, one of the contracts I put out was the town insurance contract. And come to the town board meeting, there's all these people in the audience, and they're all screaming and yelling. Long story short, and I'll have a lot of those long story shorts, it turned out that the county Democratic chairperson was the unnamed co-insurer of the town insurance contract. Never heard of that before. What it means is his name's not on the contract, but he gets to keep half the profits of it. So he's ended up spending, 2 years in federal prison, on that one. But, that's one of the things I think the state controller should be doing, is going after the issue of corruption. It's really hard to keep track of who's been convicted so far. Let's say on Friday, Steve Pigeon, who is, big political operative tied into Cuomo, pleaded guilty in Buffalo. You might have heard about the Buffalo Billions conviction. Yes. Yeah. Well, you may not have heard. What I love about the Buffalo Billions conviction is that they introduced evidence in the trial that the guy whose company they rid the big in was complaining, in writing, to the state. He says, you cannot be so obvious about how you rigged this contract. They put 25 separate, sort of data points that only this company could make. And he said, you can't do 25, do 3, but don't be so obvious. But what a lot of people don't know is right before Cuomo, a month or two before Cuomo put out that contract, which he knew nothing about, he went to the state legislature and convinced them to strip the authority of the state controller to oversee such contracts. And then he issued it. And in fact, there was an effort this year to restore that oversight to the state controller. It actually passed the Senate, because the Senate was trying to punish Cuomo for getting the IDC, Independent Democratic Caucus, to rejoin the Democrats. So the Senate Republicans passed the bill in order to embarrass Cuomo, because actually it was an assembly bill, and then the assembly killed the bill because they didn't want to embarrass Cuomo. So there's a lot more that the controller can do about corruption. I think the controller should be an advocate for fair taxes in New York State. I think he should speak up when every year they introduce the state budget, the governor fails to include the money in the budget to address the court order on equal funding for schools, particularly inner city and rural school districts. He just say that's improper. One of the things I fought him on over the years, I helped reorganize the single payer movement in New York State about 10, 12 years ago, and I was Hunger Action Network. And Tom, the incumbent, actually was a supporter of single payer health care. So I tried to get Tom as a state controller. Remember, Tom was not elected to that position initially. He was appointed by the state legislature because the previous controller, Alan Hevesy, was forced to resign. He then eventually went to prison because he was taking kickbacks on the state pension fund. But that wasn't why he was initially forced to resign. So I thought if the state controller did a study on how much we would save on going to single-payer healthcare system, and particularly eliminate the need for half of or most of the county property taxes to go pay for Medicaid, that would be helpful. He refused to do the study. Eventually I did get the state legislature to fund the study. They did a lousy study, so it only showed that we would save $30 billion by going to single-payer. And there's been other studies like that, but I'd like to see more of those studies. So we could go on, and maybe we get questions and answers more about what the controller does. Why am I running for controller? At RPI, my degree was in management, and I've been on Fiscal Policy Institute Board of Directors, so I know a lot about the budget. And people always ask me, why are you so active on the state budget, and particularly on tax issues and on budget process? Because you're an anti-poverty group. And I said, well, think about it. When it comes time to put money into the budget and fund various programs, who is at the end of the line in every single case? And of course, it's poor people. So if we want money for our programs, we have to basically really rack up the revenues because, first it goes to education, second it goes to healthcare. So if you want to put more money into the anti-poverty programs, you really got to do the revenue. So I've done a lot of revenue. But about 5 years ago, I basically came to the conclusion we're losing the fight on climate change. And that I thought that the skill set that I had learned over 40 years with ACORN and with Hunger Action Network might be helpful. So, wife's not too happy. I just quit my job, had no job lined up, and began to work on climate change. Recently the New York Times said the planet is doomed. They devoted their entire Sunday edition to that. And people argued, no one argued that they were wrong in their conclusion that the planet is doomed. They argued that the New York Times was incorrect in saying that in the 1970s and 80s, there was a moment in time when we could have done something about it because the Republicans weren't so opposed to taking action on climate change. That moment is past, and now it is too late. Climate change is acceleration. And there is both the probability that human civilization as we know it will basically end sometime within this century. And worst case scenario, human beings go extinct sometime within this century. And that's not something that people have been talking about up until the last year or so. So how many people here actually believe that humanity basically is over with at this point? We got one, we got two. Okay, for three. So those of you who don't think that humanity is over with at this point, why do you have that belief? What evidence do you have that human beings will survive what's coming in terms of climate change?
No, I don't think all of humanity, but I think the majority of it may.
Okay, so if there's 6 billion people on the planet,
it's a numbers game. So
right.
Maybe 1 million to 10 million might survive the planet, but we're, as you said, between 6 billion now.
But you still think it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Mark, it's very difficult for me to accept that thesis because of our young children.
Uh-huh.
And I cannot imagine saying that to young children.
Right.
In college and high school, and they have to be given some hope.
Right. So the question is, how do you give them some hope? You know, we're about to put out this little mailer for Howie to raise funds, and we say, you know, New York Times, humanity is doomed, planet is doomed. And then Green Party says, game's not over, vote green. We can't, if we want to change that scenario, we have to change our politics. And we have to change it immediately. Not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now. We can't be talking about going to 100% clean energy by 2050. We can't talk about, you know, in fact, in New York State, we only get 4% of the state electricity from wind and solar. And yet the governor has been blocking the development, you know, of community solar. We cannot have the governor putting $88 million into the state budget, as he has done, to build a fracked gas turbine in a poor neighborhood in Albany, where they have been for a century subjected to pollution in order to provide heat to the Empire State Plaza. We have to immediately stop the development of fossil fuels. The United Nations last week, basically said we have to get rid of capitalism. That, you know, we cannot survive, you know, climate change under a capitalist system. We cannot allow the maximization of profit to be what determines our policy on energy issues. This is the United Nations. So, you know, and I argue with scientists. Paul's pretty good on this. Barry Conway was really good on it. But a lot of scientists won't tell the truth about climate change. And, you know, they said, well, if we told the truth, people would be really depressed and really disempowered. So we got to sugarcoat it to give them hope. And I said, well, if you told them the truth about what's really happening, but tell them if they mobilize now, there is some hope, that's fine. But if you downplay the seriousness of what is going on, I mean, what you see at the poles are incredible. And the poles and the equator is where you're going to actually first see climate change occurring. I was reading one article by Daj Jamal and Truth Out, and they had this one little station up in the Arctic. And so, you know, 5 years ago, the temperature on July 6th was 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And basically, the last 4 years, every year, it has increased by 7 degrees. So in July of this year, it was 60 degrees. The Arctic Circle was on fire during the month of August. It was just burning because the drought had been, you know, the snow has been melting, the drought has occurred, it gets on fire. Sweden, which borders the Arctic Circle, climate change has become their big political issue because they are seeing what is going on to the north of them. It's not an issue here in New York State. It's not an issue in the United States. If you ask people now, the polls show that 70–75% of the public believes that climate change is a serious problem. If you then ask them, rank from 1 to 20, what are the most important issues for our government to deal with, you know, climate change is about number 19. Okay, that's not going to solve the problem. How much time do I have left?
It's over. 15 minutes are over. But...
Oh, I got to be real quick then.
Yeah, wrap up.
So 5 years ago, basically, I started a campaign to get the institutions. Well, I didn't start the campaign. 350.org started the campaign who I work with to get divestment. We've managed to divest $6.2 trillion in 1,000 institutions. Blow us away, we've done that much. Actually managed to get New York City to divest. New York City is the third largest pension plan in the United States. Ireland, yes. You're English, but you know, Bill McKibben called me up and said, can you go deliver a 12-pack of Guinness beer to Tom DiNapoli after Ireland had divested? And if you do that, I'll tweet your picture around the planet. So I did that. And they wouldn't take it at the state controller's office. So we don't take gifts. I said, it's not a gift, it's a study aid. So we've been working for 5 years to get the state controller to divest. He refuses to do it because he was appointed by the state assembly. I knew we would have problems getting the state assembly to pass legislation to require divestment. Introduced a bill anyway. I thought if I could get 50 state legislators to co-sponsor the bill, that might convince them. Got the 50 state legislators. We're not moving that bill whatsoever. He won't even meet with us. So I decided to run for state controller in order to focus on that issue of divestment, that we need to take action on climate change. But divestment is symbolic, okay? And Howie will talk more about other things we need to do. We need to go to 100% clean energy by 2030. We need to immediately stop all fossil fuels and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the purpose of the campaign, is to really highlight climate change. And to be honest, when I go around the state and tell people planet is doomed, you know, they don't believe it. And it's sort of like, well, can you study this? I mean, you know, if the New York Times, which is a kind of mainstream magazine in my opinion, you know, is willing to say that the planet is doomed or humanity is doomed, doesn't that strike you? Doesn't it strike you that Puerto Rico lost electricity for 6 months, and that most people, or half that people, also lost water for that period of time? And I always have thought that when we will get action on climate change is when a major American city is slammed by a hurricane and they do not recover. And I don't think people realize how, you know, precarious the situation was in New York City after Hurricane Sandy. And interesting, I always thought that the city that might really get knocked down and not come back up was either Tampa Bay or Orlando. And of course, the hurricane we saw last year was veering right towards that city and then veered off at the last moment. But a lot of people think the Green Party will come to power worldwide in the next 20, 30 years as climate change becomes a desperate situation. And I'm like, well, the problem is if you put us into office as the truck is going off the cliff, we're not going to be able to stop it. So if you want us to solve the problem, you have to do it now. Now, this other guy, this crazy guy, you know, 8 years ago, you know, he was running around the state because you irresponsible people in the southern tier, you know, didn't like the concept of fracking. And so he was one of the, probably the first candidate to call for a ban on fracking. I realize a lot of activists are already calling on that. And he was attacked by the big environmental groups as being irresponsible. You cannot say that we have to ban fracking. That's irresponsible. You should say, let's have a moratorium, let's have a study, you know, let's look at the water impact. And we're like, yeah, the water impact's a problem, the noise is a problem, the truck traffic's a problem. But this is natural gas. This is a fossil fuel. And methane is 82 times more potent short term as a greenhouse gas than burning carbon. You don't need to study this. This is a fossil fuel. We oppose the use of fossil fuels. We oppose, you know, banning fracking. And of course, the grassroots got that right away. And to be honest, we were following the grassroots. And eventually the big groups came in. Howie managed to get 5% in the last election for governor. And right after that, Cuomo said, oh, maybe I should ban fracking in New York State. And Howie will go down all the issues that he has raised, that Cuomo at least pays lip service to now, after he got that 5%. I was Howie's campaign manager back in 2010. We got the 50,000 votes. What did we get in 2010?
59,000, close to 60.
59,000. In order to get ourselves back on the ballot. And then Howie tripled that vote total last time. And we can triple it again this time, and we can win the election. So Howie Hawkins, Green Party candidate, you go.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to Paul and Ellen and Christine and everybody here in Binghamton that set this little meeting up. Tell you a little bit about me. Mark mentioned that I was active in politics in high school. I actually sort of came of conscience very young. I was coming up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's the Civil Rights era, and I got Japanese cousins, half Japanese, but they came out looking like Aunt Yuki, so much so that Uncle Bill, he'd get teased, are you sure those are your kids? And they're stationed in Virginia. He's a lifer in the Army. And we're all headed toward kindergarten. My cousin Joey and me, he's a year older than me. And they will send him to the colored school. And I'm thinking, you know, looking around my community, which is multicultural, you know, Asian, Latin, black, and white, and thinking, that would be terrible, you know, I'm going to go to school with my friends. So I was aware of it that early. And then when I'm 12 years old, you know, it's a Republican family. They used to brag, you know, we got an ancestor to help found the Free Soil Party, anti-slavery, civil rights. And Ronald Reagan's running around California saying we got to repeal the Fair Housing Act that just passed. The Rumsfeld Fair Housing Act. And there was a referendum to get it repealed. It did get repealed that year. The white backlash was coming. So I said, well, let's see what the Democrats do. And the Mississippi Freedom Democrats were challenging the segregationists, the Dixiecrats. And Johnson sent Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, and Joseph Rao to tell them, you got to wait. And so I'm saying at age 12, where's my party? And my party was the Peace and Freedom Party 3 years later. I was 14 and turned 15 while the drive to get enough people registered into it so they could get on the ballot. And I'm telling adults, and I had the forms, you know, you need to register in this party so we can vote against the war and for civil rights, peace and freedom. And people would say, son, why are you so worried? You know, I say, oh, I don't want to get drafted for that immoral war in Vietnam. And they say, oh, don't worry about it. It'll be over by the time your number comes up. Now, I got drafted, the war was still going on. So I think that was first a lot of experience that told me my instincts were right. And I did work with, you know, Ben Spock, 72, the People's Party, Citizens Party, Barry Commoner. And then in '84, I was at the first meeting where we started organizing the Green Party. Actually right down the road from the last convention of the Citizens Party in St. Paul, Minnesota in August. And so people say, all right, let me just say, you know, mainly I went to Dartmouth College, became a carpenter. We did green jobs before they called them that, solar and wind installations, energy audits. There were some tax credits for the high end that Carter put in, and Reagan pulled them out. And my little worker co-op that did that, most of the people went back to college. And I stayed in construction until the 90s, had a job for a while in nonprofit organizing cooperatives. And then when the money ran out for that, I went out to UPS and I was a Teamster for 17 years. And technically I'm retired now. I'm getting a little pension, which got cut by a bipartisan amendment to the ERISA Act. I won't go into all the details, but when I hear bipartisan, I reach for my wallet and I'm looking for the next war. And so, you know, I think at this point, Mark laid it out really well. We've got to, you know, make changes to solve real problems. I mean, this state has so many problems. You know, the corruption is, you know, unbelievable. I spoke at the Global Citizens Festival, it was broadcast on MSNBC, and I said, you know, among the elite, we got mass corruption. But among the poor and working class people, we got mass incarceration. You know, talking about bail abolition and speedy trial in the Khalif Browder case. You know, you heard about him accused of stealing a backpack. He wouldn't cop a plea, which, you know, over 90% of people do when they're accused. And he was locked up in Rikers for 3 years, 2 of them in solitary confinement. He got beaten by gangs, by the guards. Really traumatized him, and he took his life 2 years after his release. His brother, Akeem Browder, ran for mayor of New York to get justice for all the Khalif Browders locked up in Rikers Island and around the state, thousands of people. And so these are, you know, some of the issues. But the problems we can't solve. We got 3 primary dates in the state. And everybody says that confuses the voter. We should find one day. They can't do that. Lead poisoning. You know, this creates mass disability. There's a lot of attention you may have seen in the news about how 1,400 children have tested over the federal limit of 5 micrograms per deciliter in their blood in New York City. And I guess that may be in public housing. Anyway, it's single-digit percentages. In my city of Syracuse, 40% of the children are above that standard. Same in Buffalo, 40%. 38% in Utica. I mean, this is criminal neglect 47 years after the Surgeon General issued an urgent warning. Test the children, treat those that are over the limit, and remediate the source. Still not done. And we got austerity imposed by the state on our local government, so they can't even inspect all the units, let alone inspect them for lead and remediate. So this is a problem that is not technically hard to solve, and in half a century we haven't solved it with the, you know, the people we've got in power now. So our slogan this year is demand more. Mark mentioned how Cuomo had to respond. He couldn't take that 5% for granted. He wants to run for president. He wanted to get more votes than his father got, more votes than he got in 2010, and he got less. His percentage went down, so he had to look at what we were talking about. And he made some moves, not far enough, like the $15 minimum wage. It's $10.40 here, right now. He said it yesterday at that Global Citizens Festival. I got to the $15 minimum wage. No, he didn't. In fact, upstate, we get to $12.50 in 2021, then they're going to study it. It's still a poverty wage. So they're not solving problems. So demand more means, first of all, like Ralph Nader says, we need to raise our expectations of what we expect from government. And first thing is, they got to stop being crooks, bid rigging, straw donors, bribery, kickbacks. The leader of the Senate, the Speaker of the Assembly, Cuomo's top aides, and a lot of big campaign contributors who were getting favors, and that wasn't enough. So they start bribing people like Joe Percoco, you know, to build that competitive power ventures plant. Bid rigging in Buffalo, and there were only a few firms that had any chance of getting that job. I mean, they have no restraint. We got to get them out of there. So that's the first thing. Second thing is more reforms. We get a bigger vote this time, they can't take us for granted. And I'll explain that in particular in respect to climate change in a moment. And then the third thing is we need more than piecemeal reforms. We need system change. We need an ecological socialism based on social ownership of major means of production. Cooperatives in the private sector and public agencies and enterprises need to be democratic. Look at NYCHA. It's public, but it's not democratic. If the tenants were voting who's going to be on that board, they wouldn't have all that lead and mold and rats and roaches and elevators that don't work and boilers that don't work and roofs that leak. It's shameful. And then same thing with the subway system, the MTA. They've let it run down. It's, you know, private favors for the rich and public squalor. And we got to reverse our priorities. And the only way to do that is to have an economic democracy so we can have political democracy. Because capitalism concentrates the wealth, that translates into concentrated political power, and they run the society. You know, look at our elections. Mark gave me this quote from Boss Tweed. You can vote for anybody you want as long as I get to pick who the candidates are. Exactly. So what do we have in our electoral system? We have the money primary before we have the voting primary. And the candidates go to the rich folks, and basically they're like entrepreneurs asking for investment in their enterprise. And then the rich pre-select the candidates. They have a primary. The one that has the most money usually wins. And then they go to the general, and both parties have done that. We didn't choose those candidates. They were chosen for us by the 1%. And in this state, the 1% has grown in their share of income every year. In 1980, they were getting 12% of all the income. Now they're getting 31%. And that's why the power is more concentrated as well as the income and wealth. So we're demanding more, and what we summarize the platform as is a Green New Deal for New York. And we've been running on this 3 times. And what we really mean by that is we got to fulfill the full New Deal. Is FDR laid it out in his last State of the Union address, where he said we need a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights. Everybody ought to have the right to a living wage job if they can't work because they're too old, too young, disabled, or taking care of people that need aid. They should have an income above poverty. Everybody should have a decent home, comprehensive health care, a good education. We don't have any of those things guaranteed in this society. Democrats have had majorities in both houses with a Democratic president. Every president from Truman to Obama. We've had it in New York State. Hasn't happened. They're not going to do it because they answer to the donors, not the voters. So, and I say, and then we call it the Green New Deal because we got this climate crisis and a lead crisis and a whole lot of environmental problems. So we got to address that, and we need to add to these rights the right to a clean and sustainable environment. And so I'm just going to talk about how we're going to implement those different rights. And the full employment comes by an emergency plan to move to 100% clean energy by 2030. Hundreds of thousands of good jobs in construction and manufacturing, and the multiplier effect of that. We have a study from Mark Jacobson and scientists, engineers, and economists at Cornell and other New York institutions. Came out in 2013, said it's technically and economically feasible to do it here in New York. Not only would it create this economic boom in these jobs, it would cut electric rates in half by their estimate. because you don't have to buy the fossil fuels or the nuclear fuels. The sun shines, the winds blow, the rivers flow. We got the natural energy around us. We just need to build the technology to harvest that energy. And it ends up cutting the electric rates. A decent home. We need to not just fix NYCHA, but expand public housing. Housing should be a human right, should be regarded as a social good. That's what New York said when they did public housing before it even went federal. That was in the 30s. Different concept than the kind of mentality we have today where the only way you get affordable units is to subsidize some private developer. And I won't go into all the details, but they obviously haven't done it. So the most cost-effective way to do that is build public housing. It needs to be democratically accountable. And I think it can be a jobs program, because it's good construction jobs, an energy program, because we can build them all to be net zero carbon when they're built. It can be a desegregation program. We have the most race and class segregation of any state in the union. Nothing down in the deep south is as segregated as we are, as well as an affordable housing program. Comprehensive health care. That's the New York Health Act. A single public payer provides comprehensive health care to all New Yorkers at less cost than we now pay with our multi-payer system, with all the fighting about who pays and what's covered and what's not covered, co-pays, deductibles, premiums in the first place, a lot of out-of-pocket expenses for the things your crappy insurance doesn't cover, and then you got to pay taxes for Medicare and Medicaid anyway. A single payer save us about $45 to $50 billion the first year in the whole economy. And the right will tell you, oh, you're going to double the government budget. Yeah, but we're going to save ourselves money. Don't be dogmatic about it being government instead of private. If we're saving money and we're getting the health care better, let's go for it. Okay, what else? Education. I'm running with a school teacher like I did last time. Last time was Brian Jones, this time Gia Lee. Gia Lee teaches public school in New York City. She's a public school parent. She's been a leader in the opt-out movement against high-stakes testing, not just her kid opted out, but she opted out from administering the tests. And she's a leader in that movement. She's also a top-notch labor organizer in the teachers' unions. She's her chapter leader in the UFT. And she had a big role behind the scenes in these strikes in these red right-to-work states in Kentucky and West Virginia and Oklahoma. And she just spent a week in Puerto Rico working with those teachers because DeVos and Trump want to totally privatize public schools in Puerto Rico. And the hedge fund guys love that because they can double their money in 7 years. And that's what Cuomo has pushed on New York. High stakes testing, the bottom 5% of the schools are defined as failing. Those are always the high poverty schools because we know for 50 years of data that basically the best predictor of test scores is family income. So that brings schools into the charter industry where the investors like hedge fund guys, they get 39% off the total loan they make every year. So Juan Gonzalez wrote up a big expose of this about what was going on in Albany as an example in 2010. And I went looking for that article at the beginning of this campaign. The first thing that came up when I Googled was Investopedia. And I look at that thing and they say, you can double your money. Here's how you do it with this new markets tax credit that the feds offer. So it's not about education, it's about business. So we're saying fully fund the schools, opt out of high stakes testing, and begin a serious program of desegregation because that's the one reform that has really closed the achievement gap where it's been done. And all the students do better on things like intellectual self-confidence, creativity, problem-solving, teamwork, the things that are important qualities that all students we want to have coming out for being good citizens and being productive in their work. So that's, and I mentioned employment. So now we're at how do we get a clean, sustainable environment? And this is why we need a Green Party, because if you watch that primary between Nixon and Cuomo, Nixon was saying, you got to back the Climate and Community Protection Act. And Cuomo hasn't. It's passed the Assembly 3 times. But the irony is, you read that bill, it codifies Cuomo's policy. The only little tweak is instead of 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, it's 100% in the bill. You read the bill, they say the goal is 450 parts per million carbon equivalents in the atmosphere, which is what the International Panel on Climate Change in their 2007 report projected would keep us below 2 degrees centigrade, with a 50% chance of keeping us below 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, which is seen as the threshold beyond which we have runaway global warming and a climate catastrophe. But the science has moved on, and they said that's too high. That's why we got 350.org. Maybe you saw that article Bill McKibben wrote, the terrifying new math of climate change. And so that's why it's 350. James Hansen, probably our best known climate scientist, has written articles, and he said not only do we got to stop releasing these greenhouse gases, we got to draw them back down from the atmosphere, because the reading on Mauna Loa in Hawaii this year reached 412. And we need to get to 350. So we got to restore agriculture so it draws, we revitalize soils, which are now just holding, in chemicalized agriculture, they just hold the plants. They're not living ecosystems, and you can bring a lot of carbon back into that part of the biosphere. And then we got to do reforestation in a lot of places around the world, at least. So that's where we're at. Another thing about the Climate Community Protection Act, it says our goal is 50% clean electricity by 2030. That's Cuomo's goal. So think about it. The power sector, electric power, is 28% of the carbon footprint. Doesn't count buildings, transportation, or agriculture, which composes the rest. So if you reach that goal, you've cut the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gases we're releasing, by 14%. But the bill doesn't say we're not going to build new fossil fuel infrastructure. So that corrupt plant, Competitive Power Ventures down there in Orange County, that's the one they bribed Prococo to make sure it got permitted. That adds 10%. And this Climate and Community Protection Act doesn't say anything about stopping that. So we're really not making progress with that. And that's why I'm saying we need the Green Party, because we don't care what the politics are. I believe the Climate and Community Protection Act is what those environmental groups said the Democrats were willing to do. If we limit ourselves to what they're willing to do now, we're doomed. We've got to look at the science, look at the policies that will deal with the problem, and then solve the problem. And if it's politically difficult, well, that's the point. We've got to change what's possible. So those are the kinds of things we're running on. I could talk about, civil rights and criminal justice reforms. You can ask questions about any issue you want. But I think what I'll just, reiterate to wrap up here is that 5% we got really, got the attention. I think this New York fossil fuels bill, Mark Dunlea had a lot to do with writing. And I don't think the legislature and legislators would have given us the time of day if we hadn't got that 5%. Same reason why Cuomo went for fracking. So I want us to focus on this New York off bill like we did on fracking with a laser focus and make that a central demand going forward. And so this year, we'd like to win. There's 5, maybe 6 candidates, depending on what the Working Families does with Nixon. She wants off. We've actually said we'll take the line. We got to get a rule change in the Greens, and the rule would just change it for this one election. But I think that would electrify progressives. And I believe Working Families, they talked about it Thursday night, and they're worried that they won't get enough votes if they put the Greens on their line for their, they need 50,000 to keep their ballot line. I think they'll get more votes on their line with us than with Cuomo. Cuomo's, he's past that use-by date, his shelf life. People are tired of him. The only reason they vote for him is they're afraid of what he calls mini-Trump. I think that's a little cruel to Molinaro, but he's a Republican. People don't want Republicans, especially in the Trump age. So we'll see what they do. I know they're having some discussion, and we can go into more as to their constraints based on their funding and so forth. But I think we can have a huge impact in this election. And now I'm going to ask you to help a little bit by making a donation. If you have your checkbook with you, the campaign account is Hawkins for Governor. And do we got those forms? We need to get your information. It's on your check. All we need is name and address. But we'd like, your phone number and email so we can stay in touch with you. And were they out there, the forms?
My form is out there. I think I'll see yours is not out there. I brought some in.
It's in the trunk of my car.
I was going to see it in my backpack.
Okay. And the other thing you can do is pull out your phone right now and do it electronically. So get your phones out if you don't got your checkbooks. And I'll tell you where to go and how to do it.
But Howie,
Yeah?
we have something to sweeten the pot. and that is a number of items in the silent auction that might help people.
Oh, we got a silent auction?
Yeah, we do.
Oh, okay.
There's some lovely items out there.
All right, I didn't get that memo. So you want to do the silent auction and then we'll...
Well, people might want to choose an item.
Well, do people have questions too?
Well, yeah, I just want to get
Yeah.
people working on the money, then we can take questions as long, I can stay all day if you want.
Okay, well, why don't people look at the items and then they can choose what they want to donate.
Okay.
And then Mark, at the end of this, Mark is going to talk a little bit about the Green Park. Okay?
My name is Rick.
What am I saying?
Harassment policy, so that harassment that is, gay or people that have, not a strictly binary position is going to cover. The legislature, because they're exempt from the open meetings law, they pass a law and then they exempt themselves. They're not as scrutinized as others are under that law. And there's another weakness I'm forgetting right now, but that needs to be strengthened, and we've talked about that. It's in our platform. The other thing I want to say is, you're right, the environment, most people are concerned about it, but if they prioritize their concerns, there's a lot above it, because the environment's big, abstract, long-term, that's the way they look at it, and right now, it's a job or that rent bill or that health care problem or what's going on with the kids in school and so forth. That's why I think it's important that the Green New Deal not be watered down and narrowed down to just a climate action program that happens to create some jobs.
Exactly.
People gotta feel that they'll be secure because there are communities that depend on power plants, there are workers that depend on working in those industries. And if they don't see they will be secure as we make the transition, they're gonna resist, which they are. I'm a Teamster. Members of my local in the southern tier want fracking because they think the construction workers in our local will get more jobs that way. Even though I can send them a chart showing actually frack gas is at the bottom. And these other things, starting with doing energy efficiency, create a lot more jobs. So to me, it's analogous to the civil rights movement came to the point where they were pretty sure they'd get civil rights and political voting rights passed, but they saw the white backlash coming. So, A. Philip Randolph and Byron Russell, Martin Luther King and them said, we got to lead the whole working class, including the white folks, to get the universal rights that FDR had talked about in order to undercut the white backlash, because those white workers think they're getting competition and they're having a hard time as it is. And I think we got to think about building a climate movement in the same way.
The other thing I wanted to say, I'm a Toastmaster, so you have to know your audience. I've read a couple of research, and I've been on a couple of research teams where I've read you read other research and you build on it. Apparently, one of the reasons that Trump won is that people are not interested in the message and data. Data does not exist for the Trump supporters. But what I noticed is that you could be the most well-meant person with the best policy ever, and you would come last in the line because of how we're acculturated with a two-party system and how we're infected and injected, so we're all embedded in these ideas of what it should look like and what it should be. Don't mention getting rid of capitalism if you're not in that audience. What you could mention is the bill about rape. Point it 1, 2, 3, and this is where you could go. If anybody's interested, you could talk to me later. But these are the parts of it, because the details, unless you talk to detailed people, if you take the percentage of people who are very detailed out of 100%, you're talking about 10%. So you'll be losing the whole 80% of them right there. But if you said, I want a bill that's passed that doesn't have these features in it that will put us back right where we are right now. And it would lock us.
We know
so it depends on, because you have all the right elements, but when we're looking for somebody outside Trump to speak to us, sure, they want somebody intelligent, but they don't want to see the details of your intelligence. They want to hear, 1, I'm getting the milk, 2, we're getting the sugar, 3, the rent's getting paid. They just want the bullet points of and just juxtaposition it as to what you're going to get if you don't pick this. That is just my opinion, but what you have to do is look for others' opinions, and we have a short time before voting, and I am just making my rounds because I never thought it would sway me, because I remember telling Ian, who I'm trying to get here, Why would we vote for somebody outside the Democratic Party when we have to deal with upstate Republicans? Because upstate Republicans keep dominating upstate. Why would we take that chance right now and have another Republican in office? Because that is our deal right now. Because the fear for anybody who's Democratic is that, and the fear for the people who are Republican Trump supporters regardless, is that they won't have a voice anymore to keep spewing their racist and misogynistic behaviors. As opposed to the Green Party, how could we sway them that way? And that is just my suggestion.
Yeah, I think people should all think about that, because putting it another way, people vote more with their guts and their brains.
This is true.
And it's who they trust, what culture they're in. A lot of Trump people don't want to know about science because they're getting it from the pastor or their parents' tradition, and they just think that's what's right, and they can't be persuaded by a rational argument. You got to go for the emotional ones. One thing when I run into these Trump people is like, stop talking bad about Trump. He's for us. And I remind them, what did Trump say to us in upstate when we can't find a job? He said, move. I talked to a lot of Trump people. He really said that? And he did.
Because they're not listening.
Yeah, but that's, and they're not telling.
Democrats have the same problem too.
Yeah, that's why he doesn't care about people like us. That's what I tell him. And I think that kind of emotional thing is got to be part of the message, no doubt. No doubt.
I think some of the things too is not to ill-speak somebody too much, because if the elephant is in the room, we know he's the problem. But he didn't birth them. The country birthed a white supremacist ideology, and they ran with it by using the Bible and all the stigmas that they have to support it, because there's no science that supports anything outside of the gender binary. Nothing. Because you have the gender binary outside of every living organism, and that's scientifically proven. So people are not interested in that. They're interested in what they used to. You saw the Anne Hathaway speech that she did for human rights? Google it. And that explains everything we're talking about.
I just wanted to add on a couple of points. One, the issue of the rape culture, I don't think we have directly addressed, and it's probably something we should develop more of a way to do that. One thing about the issue of socialism, 57% of Democrats now support socialism. That's the majority of Democrats in this country.
But you have to make sure you don't use that word.
No, they use that word socialism. And only 43% of Democrats support capitalism. So that's been a major, major shift in recent years. Now, of course, the Pope, not very good on women.
And you can't say that to people who like the Pope.
Why not?
Well, but if you also look at the Pope's climate encyclical, very anti-capitalist.
Yes.
Got to get rid of capitalism. And he did make the point that we will not solve climate change if we don't solve the oppression of particularly poor people and people of color.
Correct.
I don't think he addressed women. But he recognized that the same mentality that allows us to exploit the environment is the same mentality that allows us to exploit a whole other set of people. And that was a sort of a step in the right direction. So my wife and I went to our Catholic church. We were living in Brooklyn at that point, on the weekend after the encyclical come out, to see what the pastor would say. And he said absolutely nothing. And my wife went up to him after the service and said, hey, how come you didn't talk about the Pope? Oh man, that's a complicated issue. And then, this is Brooklyn now, which I always, some people think Brooklyn's progressive. And so the bishop of the Catholics in Brooklyn wrote that the main message of the Pope's encyclical about climate change was opposing abortion. And we were like, what? And he said, yeah, because abortion is the biggest environmental issue.
Oh, good Lord.
It's, in that womb, and we're attacking that womb. And that's how, and this is Brooklyn, that's how they translated the encyclical. And that was,
That's shocking.
last time we went to church there.
That makes me, I'm not into I'm an ethical humanist. That's my own.
Well, you know, I just want, part of the reason that Howie and Mark are running and other Green Party people are running is so we can be on the ballot. Because before we were on the ballot, we got thrown off, and we got thrown off by Democrats or Republicans. They would challenge us.
Yes.
But for us in Binghamton, we've been intervening with a lot of people in the Tea Party, and they're not, you know, let's just be real specific. They're people that their children have died from opioid addiction. They're women and men that have been sexually abused, just like Democratic women or independent women. They're people that have seen their jobs decline, their rate of employment drop. They're working the gig economies. And the churches, for whatever reason, is the only thing that they have constant with them. And arguing with them rather than talking with them, or as they say in the Bible, reasoning together. And I'll give an example that we had we went to one of the first Tea Party's meetings in Endicott. Okay, it was at the Endicott Public Library, which was a contradiction in terms, because the library is the most socialist example of anybody that anybody can think of, and the Tea Party was meeting in the basement. We found out the week after the Tea Party meeting, they were having a rate hike hearing, okay? A utility rate hike hearing. And we asked them, everybody that pays NYSEG, raise your hands. And everybody raised their hand. In Endicott, they have municipal power, okay? And we said, there's going to be a rate hike hearing next week, and if you want to change it, why can't we have power like we have in Endicott? And they all showed up. And it was the largest uprising or revolt of people in Binghamton. The reporters from the press were shocked that so many people showed up. They were with us, okay? And rather than condemning them, these are our friends, these are people. We met some of them in the demonstrations against the Vets for Peace, motorcycle gangs that were, you know, encouraged to beat up the Vets for Peace. We found, you know, they were our friends. They were roofers. They were people that worked they delivered pizzas. They did all sorts of things. And one of the reasons for the Green Party to exist is that we have a paper. We have people that have forums. We found out, you know, and unfortunately, you know, we have two people running for sheriff this year. One, you know, the harder, the Republican, has been a sheriff for years. The other person that's running has a real bad history with women, a long bad history. And the first weeks of his election, a man was shot dead 2 blocks from here on the street. Okay, we had a chance we could have run a Green Party candidate for sheriff, and we had worked with Justice and Unity in the Southern Tier, and Truth Farm as well, that's fighting the opioid addictions. We had a chance to run a candidate for sheriff, and all we needed was 19 registered Greens to put them on the ballot. Now, before, it used to be hundreds and hundreds of different people. So I don't think the Tea Party should be written off as, you know, incorrigibles or whatever they're called. We need to talk with them, and we need to reason together. And that's one of the functions of the Green Party. It's not just to run candidates, but it's to go out and, in the presidential election, the Green Party, you know, Jill Stein's percentages went way up in Broome County because we went out every day and talked with people. Now, some examples of climate change locally. The last flood that we had here, it didn't hit us too hard in Binghamton, but the women, many women that lived in the trailer parks, we met them because we were distributing papers. They were living at the YWCA, and FEMA had decided that they were not included because there weren't enough of them. And they were spending the last couple of days trying to find housing, which they couldn't find. Now, the people that they meet most of the time, they're not Democrats and they're not Republicans, because the largest political party in the United States now are people that don't vote. And they're smart because they see the races as, you know, dog and pony shows on television. So they don't vote. And these are the people that we need to speak to. But who comes out and sees them? The churches. They're out every day wandering the streets. And we have to do the same thing. And that's why these two have been wandering, you know, they've been going all over. They'll come here, and then they're off in Ithaca or in Elmira, or where the hell they go.
Yeah, but you have to get them to register to vote.
Well, and that's hard because, you know, there aren't You know, that's the struggle. But it has to be one-on-one, distributing the literature, showing the films, doing the things that we do. You know, we published a small pamphlet. We reproduced it from our friends from Ithaca and other places about what to do instead of calling the police. It's gone all over town, you know, and a lot of people know about what happened at the YWC, yes. And our little pamphlet is now sold out. We're getting more copies made, and people are having these discussions. But you don't do that in the privacy of your home. You don't do it in the privacy of you know, the small groups of people that are all the same. You have to go out and talk with people.
Yeah, but Rick, if I can interrupt, we have the opportunity right now, but these two great guys represent the best in progressive politics and policies, as you heard. They're fabulous, and we have to go out and convince our friends to vote for them. So you can put signs, we can get you signs for your, however you think is best. You know how you deal with your own community, but they need our vote. And
you want to get
and anybody who wants an auction item, we just will grease the skids to give these guys a better donation.
Okay, we got yard signs you can put up. I'll bring some more in.
Yeah.
We'd like to get your name and contact information so we can stay in touch with you. And I see somebody signed up with a mailing address. That's fine, but not email. On our budget, email is a lot cheaper. So I'm going to pass this around.
Okay.
And if, are there any other questions?
I have a question, and it is a subject, and I think one that a lot of people are not really tuned into yet, and that is the threat of artificial intelligence. And I'd like to know if you've given any thought to that, if you have a position on it.
I have given it a lot of thought. There are two aspects of that. One is automation, and I've given some thought to that. The Greens, when they first adopted an economic program in Germany, said what we got to do is have a fair distribution of work and income, because as we become more productive, our productivity now is more than double or triple what it was in the 60s. Yet our income, our actual wage, is $1 less today than it was in 1973, the average wage. So all that extra production is going into the pockets of the 1%. So we've got to have a way of distributing income and work time, because we can produce what we need with less time. So that means things like 30 hours work for 40 hours pay and programs like that, which requires a system of socially appropriating and distributing that increased product. So I've thought about that angle. The other angle is artificial intelligence getting its own dynamic, so that it's like in the Space Odyssey 2001 film, it took over. And that's what I haven't thought so much about, but people I respect as scientists, I think Stephen Hawking was one of them, and there are others whose names I can't remember, said that's something we need to think about. And that's the best answer I can get. It's like, we need to think about that.
So I always, the only thing I read is science fiction. So I think a lot about artificial intelligence. And I was very struck about 10 years ago. I was driving home from Buffalo, Friday afternoon, and NPR was on. And they had a gentleman who was the head of Sun Computers, which was big at that point. And he said within 30 years, it was a real possibility that the combination of nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and computerization would create beings that would replace human beings as a dominant species on the planet. And he said, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but what I'm opposed to is the fact that there will probably be 100,000 people who have the technological capability to make this occur. And any one of them can do it. And that we need to have a public discussion about this before it occurs. And the other person they had as the skeptic said, well, that's completely unrealistic. 30 years, I think at least it will be 50 years before that occurs. And I do worry that it will become the solution to climate change. That we will, the rich will create these new beings, upload their intelligence into them, and that's how we'll create human beings or a new being that's able to solve climate change. So I do think there certainly needs to be a lot of public discussion about the role of artificial intelligence. It is rapidly accelerated, and of course most people pay very little attention to it. Other questions? Ellen?
I just love what you guys are advocating, but I do have a question. Howie, you mentioned something about the criminalization of poverty. What do you mean by that?
Well, increasingly people that can't pay their bills, particularly the rent, end up homeless. We've had an epidemic of homelessness since Cuomo took office. The rents are too high. There's no policy to really try to deal with that. And then when you're homeless, you're subjected to criminal violations, you know, vagrancy, trespassing, and then, you know, a lot of people, it's not just people that got addiction or behavior problems, it's just poor people, single moms. And another thing that happens is you get a minor violation, a traffic ticket, you can't afford to pay it, it mounts up, and then, you know, they get you for criminal neglect, and you're going to, you know, spend time in the county jail to work off that fine, and then you're in jail, you lose your job, your apartment, then you might get into more serious violations, and then you might lose your kids. That's the kind of thing that happens. And what I talked about earlier with Khalif Browder, you know, a lot of people can't make bail. That's a racket of a business. It preys upon the poor. You know, all these, you know, elites, you know, Sheldon Silver and Dean Skelos and Joe Prococo and, you know, the guys at Core Development and Elaine Colieros, the economics czar. They didn't wait in jail for their trial. They made bail, you know, and they had the high-priced lawyers, and they still got convicted. Khalif Browder, he had a $3,000 bail, accused of stealing a backpack. He couldn't make bail, and he wouldn't cop to a plea, which most people do to get out of jail and keep their job and, you know, get back to their apartment or whatever. And so the price he paid was 3 years, and then the DA, when the case finally came around, said, we don't have any evidence, dropped it. So Khalif spent 3 years, 2 years in solitary, got the crap beat out of him many times, and, you know, he was broken when he came out. That's the criminalization of poverty. Khalif, his only thing he did was be poor. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say related to that, you know, I worked for the Hunger Action Network for, you know, 28 years in Acorn before that. And you remember in 1992, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich ganged up, bipartisan effort, to end welfare as we know it. And, you know, they repealed the old ADC program, the Aid Dependent Children, and they began to impose work requirements. Now, I will say a lot of the people we represented, when they heard that welfare reform was going to be turning welfare into a jobs program, they thought that was great. Yeah. They were like, where's my job? Because that's, you know, when we, as an anti-poverty advocate, whenever we would ask, you know, at shelters or at soup kitchens what people wanted, they would say a job. And of course it was not a jobs program, but it was basically putting people, you know, more and more hours in order to receive your benefits. And now they're talking about doing that with Medicaid, they've talked about doing that with public housing, and, you know, one of the things I became involved with, excuse me? SNAP food stamps. We already have it for food stamps. And they actually have it already for public housing. We said, oh, there's another ADC program, and, you know, that's the Aid to Dependent Corporation. And, you know, how much money we give now in economic development in New York State? $10 billion a year?
8 billion.
8 billion. So much more than we're giving to poor people. Why aren't we imposing the same rules? If we think that we need work in exchange for these payments, why aren't we putting work requirements on CEOs? If we give you $100 million, or, I'm sorry, $1 billion or $750 million to, you know, as our payment, why aren't you required to go then, you know, sweep the streets for, you know, 10 hours or 15 hours, you know, a week? Why do we impose these penalties on poor people in exchange for these inadequate benefits, and yet for the rich who have much more massive benefits, you know, we don't do that? Or, you know, and I would not at all support doing this, but like, you know, the subsidies you provide under the farm program. If we ever try to put work requirements on the farmers in order to get subsidies. I mean, people would say we're nuts, but yet we do that all the time for poor people's programs. And of course, we always say any program in America that is designed to help poor people is by intention designed to operate poorly. And that only if the program is designed to operate for all people, like say Medicare or Social Security, then that's a little better operated. So we always are like, put more people into any program, because if we only have poor people in it, it's going to be a lousy program that is often very